Well, for more on this book by Chris Bowen, which he claims gives Labor its path back to power, and all those other big stories making headlines today, I'm joined now from Sydney by Sky News Political Editor Andrew Clennell. I tell you what, mate, there's no shortage of free advice from inside the Labor leadership to the leader. Lots of aspirants out there now, which sort of tells me that the boss is in a bit of trouble. This book today, On Charlatans, Bowen says the very obvious point: listen to the suburbs. Not many of these Labor MPs live in the suburbs, I have to say, that they say they represent. He's also saying they shouldn't overcorrect from Bill Shorten's loss and shouldn't be too narrow in terms of their policy agenda. What do you think of it all?
Well, I think they love writing books and essays, Peter. That's one observation I've made in the last year and a bit of federal Labor. They're too comfortable in opposition. And, you know, there's a lot of pipe smoking going on and not much actually going on in terms of winning back power. And look, I think his time would have been better devoted to formulating some decent policy, Chris Bowen. He, at least, I have to say, lives in the suburbs. He lives in Smithfield. That's southwestern Sydney. That's really the suburbs. But remember, he ran for one day and then pulled out after the election. He wants to be leader. Tanya Plibersek, I believe, wants to be leader. Essentially, there's also a view emerging in Labor, talking to a few people, that Bill Shorten is keen on either of those candidates being leader because he knows that he needs someone in between Albanese and him if he were to make a comeback. And so he'd be behind any candidacy against Albanese, notwithstanding he and Albanese can't stand each other. So it's all a bit of a mess, really, because there's no Bob Hawke, there's no Tony Blair, there's no female equivalent, there's no someone who is going to lift Labor to victory against Scott Morrison. I really believe if they were to change leadership, it's a save the furniture exercise, which might not work. I think Morrison's pretty much unassailable for the next election. It's the term after that he might have some difficulties because of the longevity of the government. But some of these people have been in Parliament a long time, Peter, and they're despairing at the fact that they're looking at what is almost a Menzies Holt Gorton era, apart from that break in the middle with Rudd and Gillard, in terms of Labor being out of power and the coalition being the natural party of government in Australia. Look,
I think I agree with you very much why Scott Morrison is Prime Minister. There isn't an obvious candidate to take on the might of Morrison. I mean, Morrison actually retails a bit more like a hawk than a conservative Liberal leader, which he is. It would be a very different proposition, I think, if there was no Morrison there, if there was a Josh Frydenberg, let's say, or a Christian Porter. I think the case for Labor is very different. But, you know, this is a book about the bleeding obvious, I have to say. And it's a bit like when Julia Gillard had to go out to the western suburbs of Sydney. Remember, she did that whole sort of entourage. She did the tour out there. And she had to sort of introduce herself to the people that have been long-term Labor's bread and butter. That is what this book felt like to me. And of course, we've got Anthony Albanese up there on his Queensland tour, been up there since the weekend. He was in Maryborough today. He's due to head over to Hervey Bay and Bundaberg. They're two LNP seats, Wide Bay and Hinkler. He had Kevin Rudd out with him on Saturday. Just on that point with Rudd, he has had Rudd out there. Today he had Chalmers, but he's had 3 or 4 days without Jim Chalmers. He turned up, as I said, today, but I thought that's, you know, worth noting. But if he's got Rudd out there, now, Rudd has no popular appeal with the blue-collar vote. Rudd looks to me like he's introduced in this sort of mini-campaign to help lock in Labor support that doesn't then fall away to the Greens, because Brisbane as a seat, and obviously Brisbane Council votes as well. We saw Jackie Trad lose her seat at the last election. Brisbane's been under siege by the Greens. So is Rudd about the Greens? And what's the story with Chalmers?
Well, maybe a little bit about the Greens. It may be a view Rudd actually retails well in Brisbane, if nowhere else. But essentially it could also be about the fact that Albanese was Deputy PM under Rudd and that he feels he owes him something, really. And Kevin Rudd, we know, is after relevance, so there you go. But look, Albanese, like Morrison's, very poll-driven, so I'm sure it was all tested first. But you're right, he wouldn't want to take him to the regions. In terms of Jim Chalmers, look, Albanese and Jim Chalmers work together. They don't really get on together. That is really a case of the old generation of Labor in the federal parliament. And I think there's an argument for a refresh there, particularly if they lose next time, versus the generation coming through, which is Chalmers. And there's a natural tension there. And Albanese, one of his people closest to him is Richard Marles. There's no real love lost, I believe, between him and Chalmers. They'll work together. They're not naturally aligned. They appeared together, but it's a point well made when you say it took a few days for that to occur. And, of course, Chalmers lives in Brisbane, so why wouldn't they be appearing together in Brisbane?
So, yeah, there's images there from Saturday. As my late dad would say, Kevin Rudd looks like he's been in a good paddock. Yes, he does look like he's been in a good paddock. Andrew Clennell, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Peter.